Hello, and welcome to the second lecture for History 252. Today's lecture is about the New South, the period after the Civil War and into the late 19th century. And today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction, which is the name we give to the political effort beginning in 1866 to bring back into the United States the states that had formed the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, and attempted to destroy the United States and to set up a separate nation. Reconstructing the country meant bringing those states back into the Union, once again creating the arrangements which had prevailed before the war, reseating congressmen, senators, and so forth. In other words, bringing those states back into the United States, reconstructing the U.S. Reconstruction was a political effort that boggles the mind of our own time. Imagine incorporating people who had taken up arms and fought the bloodiest war in American history and bringing them back into the United States in a very brief period. So Reconstruction had a number of interesting consequences, some of which were that during the years that American military forces occupied the American South and Southern states re-entered the Union between 1866 and 1870. In those years of the late 1860s and early 1870s, where American military forces occupied the South, as this image shows, in those places, that is, where U.S. soldiers were stationed, African Americans, the former slaves, generally were able to exercise many of the rights of citizenship, and in particular, the right to vote. So people who had only a few months or years previously been property, been the equivalent of a mule as far as the law was concerned, now were full voters, at least on paper, full citizens in the political sense of the United States. And these new voters exercised those rights in a very profound way, teaming up with poor whites often in states like North Carolina and beyond. They created biracial governments that by and large sought to benefit poor people in the southern states. And so we have these arrangements in which black and white legislators, black and white voters working together, set up some of the first public schools, for example, in some southern states. They raised taxes, and they used the taxes to provide those public services which had previously not been available to poor Southerners. So Reconstruction then is the political readmission of states to the Union and the various experiments that occur in those states during these years of occupation. We generally date the end of Reconstruction to the very close presidential election of 1876. In 1876, the Democrat, Tilden, and the Republican, Hayes, go down to the wire in an incredibly close vote, the closest in all of American history. The closest we've had since then is the 2000 election. And there are accusations of election illegalities all over the country, but in particular in 4 states, most importantly Florida. And in those states, because the electors are not clear, because the states return 2 sets of members to the Electoral College, there is no clear winner of the election. And so the election goes into Congress as the Constitution stipulates, and there Republicans and Democrats reach a compromise. Tilden, the Democrat, concedes to Hayes, the Republican, and he does so in exchange for the end of federal occupation in the South. Federal troops leave the South for good in 1877. Their departure ends protection for African Americans and ends a remarkable period of political experimentation and compromise from the end of the Civil War. In places where African Americans are less than 30% of the population, places like much of North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, there are somewhat paradoxical responses to the end of federal protection. In those places where African Americans make up a minority of the population, they generally continue to exercise some of their political rights, their civil rights, in the aftermath of Reconstruction. And the reason for that is because there are not enough blacks in those places to carry an election on their own. That is, they are not really a threat to white supremacists. Instead, whites can manipulate them using other means. Where we see the tremendous rolling back of African American rights, really the stripping of all legal protection and access to citizenship, is in the Deep South, where there are large percentages of African Americans in some counties, as this image shows. It's hard to read, but the darkest areas, the dark red areas that is, are places where African Americans represent between 53 and 93% of the population of those counties. So almost all black in some places in South Carolina. Those are the places where we see the most intense violence against African Americans and the most serious efforts to strip their ability to vote. So, standing and looking at the American South in 1880, slavery is destroyed, but equality is not achieved. And with the rise of segregation, which we will talk about in future lectures, an American apartheid is created in which black people are legally inferior to whites. And here we have a paradox which we have to explain as an historical problem. In almost every southern state, poor whites allied with wealthy whites against blacks of all classes. That is, poor whites voted to destroy those governments which had benefited many poor people, black and white, in the American South in the 1870s. To roll back, for example, the taxes that had promoted public schools, which largely benefited poor whites as well as blacks. Why did whites unite, even against their own interests against blacks? Why is it, as one famous American historian has put it, why is it that race trumps class in so much of American history? We'll consider these questions in a future lecture, but I'm going to provide some possible explanations today as well. So the New South, this New South of sharecroppers and of African Americans who briefly exercised the right to vote and to citizenship, this is a very interesting place. It's a place which increasingly will be dominated by landless poor, as this image shows us of North Carolina in 1890. This is sharecropped farms as a percent of total farms in each county across the state in 1890. And what you see is that there are numerous counties, including in the Piedmont, where 35% and above of the farms in each of those counties are managed by sharecroppers or run by sharecroppers. And this is a stark contrast to the period before the Civil War, when states like North Carolina in particular, and the South in general, had the highest rate of land ownership in the U.S. It was really the closest thing to the kind of agrarian landscape of independent or yeoman farmers, men who own their own land, that Thomas Jefferson had imagined during the earliest years of the United States. But instead, what we see, especially in the Deep South, is a new kind of landscape, a landscape of segregation. The end of Reconstruction brought so-called Redeemer governments, in which white supremacy became the name of the game, the rule of the day. White rule was restored, and increasingly the antebellum South would be fondly recalled in lost cause myths, created in monuments, literature, music, and eventually in movies like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. Here, for example, is the Confederate monument at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, showing on the right-hand side an African-American slave holding up a white child to his father as he goes off to defend slavery. So here's a monument which imagines that African-Americans, slaves in the South, supported the Confederacy in that war. So these Redeemer governments were characterized not just by white supremacy, but also by a completely different attitude toward the purpose of government. Very limited services, much lower taxation, much more support for business and industry over small farmers, and in many ways, elite rule over both poor whites and blacks. In fact, even more so than had been true before the Civil War. This again is why it's interesting that poor whites would support these governments through their votes. So despite the conservatism of local governments, the New South and its citizens experienced profound social, economic, and cultural changes that mirrored in some ways what had been happening in the Northeast and Midwest for the few years before the war. And the most important agent of those profound changes was an extraordinary technology, perhaps the most important technology in all of American history. And of course, I'm talking about the railroad. The railroad changed people's lives in ways which are hard for us to understand today, a time in which we imagine connections between cities, states, countries, that the entire globe is only a matter of nanoseconds apart, thanks to the internet. What the railroad did was to make possible the movement of people and goods across space. Railroads profoundly changed everyday life all over the United States, but especially in the U.S. South after the Civil War. And in large part, this was because the railroads had not been in the South before the war. It was the region with the least railroad miles. Railroads would come to resemble a spider's web that spread across the American South, as this image shows us from the 1880s. Railroads spread more rapidly in the South in the decades after the Civil War than they did in the nation as a whole. Track mileage doubled in the South between 1880 and 1890. In North Carolina, it grew by 250% between 1880 and 1900. Redeemer governments encouraged railroad building. They did so through low corporate taxes and lax regulations, to some extent through subsidies. Railroads spread the South's incorporation into the market economy with dramatic consequences for the region and its peoples. For one thing, it gave ready access to distant markets. It meant that things that American Southerners made could be shipped across not just the sea by boat to London and to the mills of England, but also across the country itself. They meant that things you made in North Carolina could be sold in Cincinnati, or in Kansas City, or even in California. And the railroad created a kind of market revolution in the South, annihilating space, making it possible for people and the things that they grew or made to move across the country. So, who rode those rails? Pushed by the economic, social, and environmental devastation of the war, and pulled by the allure of new opportunities, large numbers of people would relocate across the South in the decades after the Civil War. The urge to move was probably strongest amongst the freedmen, the former slaves, who fled the South in large numbers for any place that railroads could take them, mostly to western and northern cities. And this image shows us one explanation for that desire. This is the Chicago Defender, a famous African-American newspaper in Chicago. And here it shows a well-dressed African-American Southerner with his suitcase in hand, fleeing the lynching, the violence, the political repression, and also the lack of economic opportunity imposed in the New South. The 13 southern states would in fact experience a net loss of over 500,000 African Americans in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, as freed people, especially young men, moved into the cities of the Midwest and Western United States. But while we justly celebrate and recognize the amazing impact of these migrations, we should also recognize that even more white people were on the move. After all, there were far more white Southerners than there were black Southerners. Between 1880 and 1910, over 1.2 million white Southerners left the American South, and most moved to the Southwest. They moved to Texas and to the states of the former Southwestern Confederacy, sometimes as far as California. Most often, though, both whites and blacks remained in the region, but they moved from family farms and plantations to nearby towns and cities. Urban growth, and especially small town growth, is one of the most distinctive characteristics of the late 19th century South. And part of this movement was economic. It was the loss of opportunity in the countryside, as we will see in a moment. But it was also in part driven by opportunity. in the city and in the country. One planter in Hawkinsville, Georgia, became very anxious about lack of laborers, and especially white laborers in his community. He said, "White children were leaving farms to go to town and hunt jobs. If a boy has any move in him, he wants something better than what he can get here on the farm." So towns and cities tended to spring up around railroad depots as these sites offered goods, services, and markets that were unavailable elsewhere in the rural South. And we can see this in a couple of American cities that we now imagine as rather important. Atlanta, Georgia was a small town in 1860. When Sherman marched through in 1865, it had just 14,000 inhabitants. And at that, it was one of the most important cities in that part of the South. But in 1870, Atlanta had 22,000 inhabitants, 37,000 in 1880, 90,000 in 1900. So much of this growth, this extraordinary growth, took place in villages under 2,500 people, in relatively small places, where stores and schools and social life attracted anyone who was ambitious or who needed a job. Compared to the North, the South remained a rural landscape. But compared to the South of before the Civil War, the New South saw dramatic urbanization and change. Some of that change included industrial work. These Birmingham steel workers were typical of one of the new kinds of industrial manufacturing possibilities in cities like Birmingham, Alabama. Railroads concentrated jobs and capital. They made it worthwhile and advantageous to build a factory in a place where you could ship out finished products. Accessibility to new markets that the railroads offered fueled growth in textiles and mining, in lumber and cigarette manufacturing, and in steel, as well as an emphasis on cotton cultivation, which would come to dominate the American South. African Americans often worked in these new industrial jobs. In 1880, 41% of Birmingham's industrial workers were black. In 1907, African Americans made up 39% of all steel workers in the South. That is, they were overrepresented in steel compared to their total population in the southern states. In general, Southern industrial growth was concentrated in extractive industries that produced relatively few salaried middle-class professionals and paid most of its workers, men like these two, roughly half the prevailing wages found elsewhere in the country. So Southern labor, in a pattern which would continue into the 21st century, was typically lower paid than other regions of the U.S. And much of the capital, much of the actual ownership of these factories was located in distant places. In Europe, where investors poured money into the New South, and especially in the northern United States. And so the profits from these industries tended to flow out of the South to northern cities and overseas. One major exception to this pattern of northern ownership of southern industry and of northern investment was the first major growth industry of the New South. And of course I'm talking about cigarettes. Julian Carr of Chapel Hill capitalized on a phenomenon that appeared during the Civil War, which is that both Northern and Southern soldiers, both U.S. and CSA soldiers, grew fond of North Carolina bright leaf tobacco during the war. They encountered this tobacco with its particular flavor, its mildness, as a smoking tobacco during the Civil War. And what Julian Carr did was to capitalize on this potential national market by spending large sums of money marketing his tobacco, his chewing and smoking tobacco, often for pipes, under the Bull Durham label. In 1883, 5 million pounds of this tobacco sold, and the plant where it was manufactured came to occupy 15 acres in Durham, North Carolina. Washington Duke took the industry a step further when he introduced the mass production of cigarettes in 1880, developing a machine that could produce 200 cigarettes per minute. Cigarettes were the perfect industrial drug. They allowed people, working people, to consume nicotine, tobacco, in a form which could be done on the job. Instead of having to pack your pipe or find a place to spit your chaw, the cigarette allowed a person to take a 5 or 10-minute break from work, just the amount that they were allowed from the machines that they tended. And cigarettes became the great industrial drug of the 20th century. Duke industrialized the production of cigarettes. By putting every facet of manufacture under a single roof, Duke kept costs down and he pushed his competitors out of business. He became a kind of monopoly in North Carolina. So the urban growth that cigarettes represent was as much a product of urban opportunity as it was of rural poverty. Poor farmers pushed off the land by lower prices and less opportunity, pushed into the cities and the towns where they found low-paid but steady industrial labor. Rural poverty was largely a result of the agricultural monocultures encouraged by the market revolution that the railroads offered. Production of commodities for the market had dramatic and dire consequences for Southern agriculture. Paradoxically, it was in the countryside where the most profound effects of the marketplace were felt. And we especially see this with one extraordinary crop, cotton. Farmers who were desperate for capital after the war, families who had lost their mules, seen their barns burnt, had all of their seeds stolen by either Northern or Southern armies, both of whom requisitioned whatever they could get from the people around them. Those farmers were desperate to rebuild and for capital, for cash, after the war. And so they planted cotton, which was the only commodity sure to bring cash. To do that, they cut back on every other kind of crop, and in particular, on food production. Cotton farmer J. Pope Brown, who had been a small yeoman farmer before the war, put it this way. "We were poor," he said. "We had nothing to go on. We had no collateral, and we just had to plant the crop that would bring money right away. We did not have time to wait." And so men and women, families who had planted a variety of crops in a kind of semi-subsistence, independent farming manner across the American South, especially the upcountry South, these families now increasingly concentrated on one crop, on cotton. And railroads exacerbated this trend. Railroads could take away cotton, as this image shows us here from 1866, from Raleigh. They could take cotton to new markets in the north. But they could also bring things to the south. This is a two-way flow. Railroads allowed the mechanized agriculture and the massive expansion of cattle grazing in the Midwest and Great Plains, which we will talk about in a future lecture. They allowed all of that cheap beef and wheat to flow into the American South. It became cheaper to buy food in places like Raleigh than to grow it. It made it possible for these farmers to focus ever more often on a single crop, cotton. And farming became, even for the small farmers, entirely a cash business. By 1880, 60% of Southern farmers failed to grow enough grain, corn or wheat, that is, to meet even their own consumption needs. They had become entirely market-driven, market producers. With so much time and money invested in a single crop, any bad year could throw a farmer into debt, forcing him to produce yet more cotton, since it was the only cash crop with which to pay off his debts. And so as farmers overproduced cotton, their own surplus production further depressed cotton prices. It pushed down cotton prices. And it exhausted the soil that they used, which meant that their future crops would be lower. So in response, many poor farmers had more children, hoping to increase their own production, the profits, the amount of labor that they could use to get more cotton off the land. But of course, these children had almost no chance of escaping poverty in this cycle of lower prices, more labor, and fewer opportunities. Children were forced to work during the cotton harvest. Even where public schools were available, they rarely had the chance to receive an education. And so once again, we see the spiral in which people were trapped. So the rural South, by almost any measure, became an increasingly desperate place in the late 19th century. As one crop scientist at North Carolina State put it, you would not want to live in the late 19th century American South. Not in the rural parts of the South, at least. It was a very difficult and very dark time for both blacks and for whites in the American South. So people left. If they could, they left for the cities. They hung on where they could, and if not, they headed out for the city, north, west, and into the cities of the American South. Even so, because of population growth in the rural South, the United States South would continue to have the highest rural population density in the United States, more than double than in northern states. Eventually, many of the marginal farmers, those small farmers who before the war had, as I had said before, been independent, who grew a variety of crops and were only partly involved in the cash economy, eventually, thanks to the need for cash, and especially for cotton, many marginal farmers lost their farms. They had to pay their debts, and so they became renters or sharecroppers, or they moved to cities for wage work. And so this family here, these folks might have been farm owners in 1860 who became sharecroppers in 1880. In the 1870s, roughly a third of the farmers in the South were renters or sharecroppers. But by 1900, that figure had reached 70%. 70% of farmers in the American South did not own their own land by 1900. And so as white yeoman farmers lost their land, they lost also a sense of independence, a sense of pride, a sense of history. They were increasingly forced to compete with free black people as renters and sharecroppers, which was humiliating for many of these men and women. Resentment at this economic and social proximity to African Americans pushed many whites towards the white supremacist patterns of the new political order. It pushed them to support segregation, racial violence, and democratic white rule. Even though those new political parties, that white supremacist political system, rarely served the economic interests of poor whites like these people in this photograph. And so race came to trump class. And so, in the end of the 19th century, we see a new kind of American South, a place which we could imagine as a tragedy. Poor black and poor white sharecroppers in a land that once had been home to some of the world's greatest export economies and to the highest rate of farm ownership in America. The single crop cotton that had once brought incredible wealth to at least some in the American South became a symbol of inescapable poverty. The words King Cotton had a very sarcastic and painful ring for people in the 19th century. So this story about the American South is an example of the uses of history. How Americans would come to remember Reconstruction matters immensely to the kinds of stories they would tell about their own time in the 20th century and beyond. So, for example, the Redeemer governments and the Lost Cause memorials, they recalled Reconstruction with its political experiments, for example, the right for African Americans to vote, as a disaster, as the extension of federal powers, as a time of big government. That is how they portrayed the efforts, for example, to build public schools, to raise taxes, to pay for roads, and for the other elements that benefited poor people in the American South. And so they used history to justify their own present, which was the age of segregation. In my story that I've told you today, I've suggested another kind of possible answer. These are both stories. They're both based on evidence, or at least I hope mine is. But we're left with interesting questions. questions which I hope we will resolve in some of our future lectures. For example, how is the American West, also a new kind of landscape in the post-Civil War years, how is it like or unlike the New South that we've described here? How are the conditions for blacks in the New South like or unlike the lives of Indians in the American West? We'll take up those questions in our next lecture.